Welcome, everybody, to the Mariana Kistler Beach Museum of Art. My name is Linda Duke, and I'm the director here. And I'm kind of a newcomer at almost 6 years at the beach. But this evening, we're going to hear from some of the people who were here at the very beginning, or even before the beginning. So this should be a wonderful history lesson. Before we plunge into that, I'd like to take a few minutes to introduce our panelists. Tom Rawson earned a bachelor's degree and 2 master's degrees from K-State. He has a PhD in higher education administration from the University of New Mexico and was director of fiscal affairs for the Kansas Board of Regents for 13 years. Director of Fiscal Affairs for KU's Lawrence campus for 3 years, and Vice President for Administration and Finance at K-State for 19 years. So a very distinguished and lengthy career serving K-State. He and his wife, Diane, who is also a graduate of K-State, have 2 children, and they are loyal to the university. So thank you for coming tonight, Tom. Next in line is Charles Reagan. Chuck Reagan graduated from Holy Cross College in 1964 and got an MA in 66 and a PhD in 67 from the University of Kansas. He started as an assistant professor of philosophy at Kansas State in 1967 and became professor and head of the philosophy department in 1980. He was chief of staff for President Weefald and responsible in that capacity for McCain Auditorium, the University Attorney's Office, Affirmative Action, and then in the mid-90s, the Beach Museum of Art. After the resignation of the museum's first director, Nelson Britt, Chuck became interim director for a full 16 months and led the search for a permanent director, hiring Lorne Render at the end of that period. All in all, he was at K-State for 49 years before retiring last July. Chuck Reagan was chairman of the Landon Lecture Series from 1984 until 2010, and during that time brought to Kansas State 92 prominent figures in politics, journalism, economics, religion, and history. He also had a career in aviation. What has this man not done? Serving as a commuter airline pilot, a flight instructor, and a pilot of the K-State King Air turboprop. And for 11 years, he was captain of the university jet. Dr. Charles Reagan is married to Sharon Reagan, a retired speech pathologist, and they have 3 children. Lastly, Gary Hellebust graduated from Kansas State University in 1969 after studying animal science and industry. He has owned and operated Hellebust livestock farms since 1971, producing purebred hogs and cattle. He joined the Kansas State University Foundation as Director of Corporate and Foundation Relations in 1987. He became president and CEO of the foundation in 1998 and retired from that position in 2010. During his time as president and CEO of the Kansas State University Foundation, more than $900 million was raised and received by the foundation in support of university programs. Gary and his wife Lois have 2 children and 2 grandchildren and continue to run the farm near Olsburg. So we have a really distinguished group of people with long histories of service to the university and leadership at the university. And I'm going to get out of the way while they tell you some of the stories of the origin of this museum. And I will pass the torch to you, Chuck, to start that conversation.
Thank you. So we've been asked to use a microphone for the video recording. So, well, the stormy weather tonight brings with it some good news. The Weather Service says that the storms will be over around 8 or 8:30. So we've each decided to extend our comments for about 45 minutes each instead of 15 minutes. Some of it will have to be filler. So what we're going to do is not each of us make a presentation so much as have a conversation among the three of us about the involvement that each of us had in the origin and the building and the operating of the museum. So I know that Chuck Stroh and Jessica Richmond gave a program on Tuesday. And Ray Stamey. We were out of the country, but I'm glad to know that because I have a lot of very nice things to say about all three of them. And so I thought I'd just start from the beginning. President Weefald was selected in April to be the president of Kansas State. And about in June, he asked me to be his assistant. And Chuck Stroh, the head of the art department, did a magnificent job of orchestrating a letter-writing campaign. And the Weefalds received probably 50 or 60 letters from people wanting an art museum and 3 or 4 letters from people who wanted something else. And so they knew when they got here that building an art museum was a high priority, at least for some people on the campus. And at the time, if you can recall the history, there were lots of other issues that for President Weefald took a higher priority, like stopping the decline in enrollments and the public image and so forth. And no one, by the way, asked him to do anything about the football team because everyone thought that was futile. So that wasn't on, by the way, that was not on the priority list. Art museum was on it, a parking garage was on it, higher faculty salaries, better public image, enrollment increases. Anyway, the art museum was on it, and we were very fortunate that Ruth Ann Weefald decided that she would make that her cause. And so she devoted an enormous amount of time and energy to trying to develop friends and funds for the art museum. And this, by the way, was in the face of being told by a feasibility expert that there was no possibility of having a museum at Kansas State University because no one wanted one and no one would put up any money. Well, here we are. So Jessica Richmond had been hired previous to that, maybe by a couple of years, by the provost, as far as I can recall. Maybe you can fill me in. And her job was to find, catalog, and recover the university's art collection that was scattered out in hallways, dean's offices. Tom had 2 or 3 in his office. There were some in the president's office. There were some that were hanging next to an elevator in the student union. And so you can have 2 hypotheses. One is our students are so honest, no one would lift that off the wall and take it to their apartment. Or they didn't know what it was. I tend to like the first explanation, they're so honest. And so Jessica and Ruth Ann went around the state, beginning in Hayes, with Mariana Beach, hosting the first luncheon. And this was to raise friends. She did it in Garden City, Topeka, Wichita, Lawrence, virtually all over the state. And that was the beginnings of getting the friends, and as Gary will tell you, that effort raised 300,000 or 400,000, which was sort of the beginning funding for the museum. And then in 1991, Ross made his initial gift of $1 million, and that's really what launched the museum. And after that gift was made, over a weekend, the next Monday, President Weefald and I had a conversation, and I told him that you needed to have a building committee and an operations committee. And Tom chaired the building committee, I chaired the operations committee, and then, of course, the money man was, in the end, the most important, because if you don't have any money, we just chair meetings. So I'll just continue briefly. Tom's going to talk about the selection of architects and the selection of the construction company. But what we had to do with operations was to begin by hiring a staff. Now, the university made some mistakes in building the Coliseum because they didn't hire a professional Coliseum director from the beginning. And they also had an architect that had never built a Coliseum. And that led to enormous problems, but that's not the topic tonight. I can entertain you about that over some beers sometime. So we wanted to have a director on board as early as possible and then start building up the staff so that by the time the museum opened, there was a full complement of staff ready to operate the museum, a program of exhibitions lined up, because those are lined up 2 or more years in advance. And so we had to have the exhibition program lined up and then be ready to operate a museum. And when we built the Dole Center, we did that. We hired Mel Chastain right from the very beginning, before even the architects were selected, because he knew how the center would operate, and that was important in driving the architectural program statement and the design and finishing of we wanted to follow that model rather than the Coliseum model. And so the committees got together in November of 1991, were the first meetings. And Tom, why don't you talk about the architectural selection and the selection of a construction company and even the site of the museum, which is controversial.
Sure was. Okay, thank you, Chuck. In thinking about how this all evolved and comparing the evolution of this particular project with some of the others that I was involved with, like the new library and so on, this one was probably the most fun of all that we had in my career of 19 years. It was fun because it was collaborative. We did not sit around in our ivory tower and think about what it is that an art museum should have and hire a person to design a building to contain those thoughts, and then hire a contractor to build it, and at the end of the process say, oh, here's your new museum. We didn't do that. We had a building committee, and since I'm now old and forgetful, I wrote down some of the names, because there were a couple on the list I couldn't have named without actually going back to the files. But we had a professor of landscape architecture, Rick Forsyth. We had the dean of architecture, planning and design at that time, Lane Marshall. We had a professor of art, Gary Woodard. We had a representative of the foundation, Jack Goldstein. In addition, we had some staff members like Chuck and Gary and myself. We had Michael McNamara, who was an associate professor of architecture. His specialty was in building programming. And Michael drafted the building program statement for this facility. The program statement is what is used to hire an architect and design the building. So we had some really good professional help that normal projects like this would not have. A normal project has a couple staff people at the university, sit down with an architect, and away you go. We didn't do that. It was collaborative. It was kind of the John Weefald collaborative community type approach. So we also had, as Chuck said, Nelson Britt. Nelson was hired as the first director because he had been through an art museum building project, and we thought it was very important to have someone with that capability. So we had a committee that was well-rounded, diverse, very interesting people. We began meeting in the fall of '91, and we met at least once a month for a year and a half. And it was a fun thing. We enjoyed it. The first thing we had to do was to develop and fine-tune the mission statement and the set of goals for the museum. The first drafts of those two things were, I think, assembled by Jessica and Nelson, and then the committee took a look at them, refined them, and in the end, with the collaboration of others on the campus, approved them. And those particular statements were then forming the basis of the building program statement. What on earth is it you're going to build? What is the mission of the art museum? And how can that mission be reflected in a building? And that is a challenge, and that's why Michael McNamara was so helpful to us, because he was really an expert in translating the needs into some words that architects can understand. And so we spent literally months developing the program statement for this building. And in the end, after that program statement, which, by the way, is only about 30 pages long, but it talks about a 33,000 square foot facility and a $5 million budget, and we have to have space of this type and that type and so many galleries and so on and so on. At the end of that process, that program statement then is approved not only by us at the university, but by the Kansas Board of Regents, and also an animal called the Legislative Joint Building Committee. So you can't turn any dirt or hire any architect until you have those particular checkoffs, and that takes months and months, and we did it, and it was fun. So now we have a program statement. Who are we going to hire to translate the words into the drawings, and how are we going to do it? So there were some on the committee that said, gee, we only want to hire a K-State architect because it's a K-State building. And that was tough for a while, but even the Dean of Architecture said, no, I don't think that's the right approach. We ought to go out and have a competition and see what we can find, because there are other good architects around that have not graduated from K-State. So we did that. We had a two-step process. The first step of the process was to develop an RFQ, a request for qualifications in this instance, and so we did that. And we, of course, referenced the mission statement and the program statement and so on, but said, gee, if you're interested in designing this building at K-State, send us your name and all the information and what your qualifications are, and we'll consider you. And we got 44 firms from across the country that wanted to do that, that were interested. So how in the world are we going to winnow that down to something that's reasonable? So after that first step, a request for qualifications, we screened that down to, I think it was 16 or 17 firms. And how did we screen it? Well, we relied on the College of Architecture and some of their faculty members who had knowledge of virtually all of these when you put them together as a group, firms. And so we winnowed the list down to about 16 firms and said, okay, you're now in the next batch of architects. You're still in the hunt, so to speak. So we would like you to go the next step further. We want you to submit a series of schematic drawings and some prose to talk about your concept of this building. And we'd like to have them put on poster boards because we're going to display them, and we're going to look at them, and we're going to compare them. And so they did that. Also, I think there were 16 firms from across the country. Submitted all the information, and we went out to the Foundation Center at that time up on the top floor, and we hung all of these posters throughout the floor. And then as a group, as a building committee, and as faculty members from architecture, landscape architecture, art, whatever, they all had a chance to go through and look at the different concepts. And that was a fun process. It wasn't easy to winnow it down to 4 firms, but we did that. And we ended up with a firm from Boston, a firm from New York City, a firm from Austin, and a firm from Philadelphia. Obviously, no K-State, no firms that had K-State principals, let's put it that way, partners. So there are 4 firms. So how in the world are we going to select, as a third step, the finalist? We ask each firm to fly to Manhattan, Kansas, and make a presentation. And so indeed they did. And they came in and made a 2-hour presentation, and they stood for questions. And again, the same fun group quizzed the architects, and our architects quizzed the visiting architects about how they would do this and how they would do that. And eventually we decided that it was probably better to have a subgroup make the final decision, because it's kind of hard to have consensus among a whole bunch of faculty members, administrators, and so on. And so we had the director of facilities for the regions. We had a retired architect who was really a great design architect who no longer practiced but had a great reputation in the field. Then I was on the committee, and I'm sitting here trying to decide who the other one was. Was it Gary? Were you? Let's see here. I'll find it.
In an unofficial capacity, if not.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, here. Yeah, you were on it. So we, as a group of 4, selected the finalist and defined the winner of the architectural contest, if you will. One of the things that I probably should have pointed out is that the firm from Boston, very, very good firm, nationally known, great reputation, had read that we have tornadoes in Kansas. So their concept was to have a nice, great big lobby with a plexiglass tornado right in the middle as the centerpiece of the whole museum. They thought it was great. We didn't think it was so great. So we went on and eventually hired the firm of Moore Anderson from Austin, Texas. Charles Moore was on the verge of retirement at that point, a very noted design architect. Arthur Anderson was a KU graduate, but that went okay. He was very talented also, and so Gary and I had not met Charles Moore, so we flew to Austin to visit their rather small headquarters in something that was sort of like a house, as I recall, out in the suburbs of Austin, and we had lunch with Charles Moore and Arthur. And Charles took out a napkin. I'll never forget this. Charles took out a paper napkin at the restaurant and said, "This is the way I think it ought to be." And guess what? That's how it is. Including the concept of the museum being located at a very good spot that connects the community with the campus. And that was his concept. And that's the first that we'd heard of it. I don't know whether he had thought this through in advance or whether he just happened to come up with it on the fly. But in essence, his strength was conceptual architecture, contextual architecture, fitted in the context of the surrounding buildings and community, and so on. And so Gary and I flew back to Manhattan, agreeing that that was the right firm to do it. Long story short, Arthur was the one in charge. Charles Moore helped when required, and they really did a bang-up job. They had some thoughts that didn't work out, but in all projects that happens. Got the design, the architectural drawings done. They had the necessary approvals. Now it's time to hire a contractor. So we talked to the foundation folks and said, could you give us a list of 6 or 8 firms that have done work for K-State that would be willing to give us a great bid, maybe do some gifts in kind, and have them submit a sealed bid. And we did that. They submitted a sealed bid. We had a bid opening, and it turns out that the EB Construction Company was the winner of that bid. They were a winner in several ways. They had the low bid, but also they were well known for the concept of partnering in the construction process. Many companies will come in and say, okay, we're going to build your building, and when we're done, we'll tell you, and you can have it. Well, EB Company didn't do that. EB Company had the architect and the architect's representatives, the campus community, the subcontractors and everything meet about every 2 to 3 weeks and talk about the status of the project, what was going right and what was going wrong, and so on. And we thought that was very valuable. In my opinion, we haven't done very many buildings during my time. We didn't do very many buildings that way. But it was a great model. It worked well. EB did a great job. There were some things that we found that we didn't know and we should have known. For example, there's an underground river that goes under the site, and we were going to do this slab on grade, and that doesn't work very well, so they bored piers, and that added to the expense of the project. You always have those things, but that happens. So that's about the story of the selection of the architect and the contractor. It wasn't a state process. It was kind of unique, and it was fun.
So you can see that these things are complicated. And Tom has told you sort of the basic outline of it, but there were complications at every stage, and we'll get into some of those in our discussion. But once again, it takes money. And Gary, even though he was the president, personally took on the responsibility of the museum as his project. And so, Gary, why don't you talk about the fundraising and how that went?
Well, first I want to clear up that as a College of Agriculture graduate, I was highly qualified to raise money for an art museum. And it's something that Ruth Ann, in fact, I had a visit with Ruth Ann the other day, and she reminded me of that. But we had a lot of fun doing it, and fundraising part was a lot of fun, and it was probably one of the best memories I have having been at the foundation. I started the project about in 1988, and if you recall, that's about a year and a half after Ruth Ann and John had come to Manhattan. And Ruth Ann had championed this like no one I have ever seen before in my life, and I give all the credit to her as far as being able to put together the program that we were able to go out and basically sell. And that's what my job was. A couple of other folks I wanted to mention on those early years was Mary Lee Graham and Pat Condorman. Both of those were highly influential in working with the Friends of Artists. I think that's what it was called at the time. And so to let you know the time frame of this, the Weefalds got here in '86. In '88, I came on board. We were starting to develop plans for the Essential Edge campaign, which was the first multi-million-dollar campaign, a 6-year campaign in the history of the university. On campus, everyone was vying for a piece of the pie, at least to be included in the Essential Edge campaign, their specific college, their program, etc. And the Art Museum was kind of sitting out there at the side, and by sheer willpower, Ruth Ann got that injected into the Essential Edge campaign, to be quite honest about it. My role with the campaign was the College of Agriculture. At that time, I was Corporate and Foundation Director. And by default, I said I'll go ahead and work with the Art Museum. I had gotten to know the Weefalds fairly well. So that's how we started on this. Ruth Ann had put together all of these meetings, and it generated excitement. But quite honestly, there was no concrete building plan, no anything to sell at that point in time. So what we did, we had the feasibility study came back and said we'd be lucky if we raised $1 million, if that. The architects at the university projected, I think about, $4 million, something like that. So we had a gap, and we had about a $300,000 endowment that had been given over the years by people with the vision that perhaps someday there would be an art museum. And so utilizing that as seed money, that's where we really got started in all the processes that Tom and Chuck have talked about. And I'm not going to belabor the whole fundraising effort, but what it amounts to is during the feasibility study, you ask questions of folks that might be interested throughout the university. That's you hire a separate contractor to do that. And they may go and talk to Dan and Beth Bird, for example, about what they might want to support on campus as part of the Essential Edge campaign. They'd probably start with agriculture and some other things and move from there. They'd eventually get to a question about the art museum. If and when would you be interested in supporting the art museum, and at what level? Most people will give you a pretty low level. Okay, so what that does is that opens a door, and that began to give us a constituency to begin to work with and to take a look at. I had worked with the beaches with the journalism program that was in dire need of an endowment. They were close to losing their accreditation. And in doing that, the beaches came up with $1 million donation to the endowment, which basically put everything back on track. And then Ruth Ann became very good friends with Mariana. And over a period of time, that developed into a good relationship where we talked about this. And at that point in time, R.M. Seaton, I believe, had pledged already $500,000 or so, the Seaton family, and a few others. But we didn't have that major lead gift, and I did not have anyone that would go out and commit to a major lead and then go work with me in recruiting more gifts. Ross Beach and I sat down one evening, and he told me what he was willing to do. He asked me what a naming opportunity would basically cost. And I told him half the price of the project. And at that time, we weren't sure what the price was, but it'd be in excess of $4 million. He looked at me and he said, let's have dinner with John and Ruth Ann. And at that time, Bob Higgins was our national chairman of the Essential Edge campaign. And at that point in time, John asked him for the leadership gift, which he committed $1 million at that point in time. Over a period of time, Ross and I had more or less an unwritten agreement that they were going to go ahead and do at least $3 million. Ultimately, the beaches ended up at about $6 million in both the whole project. A number of people had stepped forward at that point in time, and I know I'm going to leave some out, so I'll just run down this real quick. But we talked about the Seaton family, Tom and Luann Dunn, the Birds sitting right here, E.B. and Greer of E.B. Construction, Orville Hempfer, a lifelong resident of California that graduated from K-State, and that's quite an interesting story. If we ever get time, we'll talk about that. The Veneers, Jack Goldstein, Barbara Wilson, that's the parking lot outside. They insisted they wanted a paved parking lot, and that's why we've got it. Virginia and Perry Pine, Crosby Kemper, the whole Kemper establishment, Archie Heil, their family. I mentioned the Birds, the Stolzers, and Mary Jarvis are some of the folks that were involved in it. I'm not going to take a whole lot of time, but fundraising, in my opinion, is fun. I enjoyed it. I enjoyed the ability to find people. And foundation, what we do is we're a catalyst. We bring together the need with someone who might be interested, and then we let that happen. It's not the foundation raising the money, it's people talking about something that's dear to their heart, and that's what this whole building program was. The beaches still rank up as probably my top 5 people in the world as far as dealing with someone professionally for 20 years. And I'll leave it at that because I'd much rather just talk about stories. If you're interested in how anything got done fundraising-wise, we can.
Thank you, Gary. There's a couple of Ross and Mariana Beach stories that I'd like to tell. One of them is when the museum finally opened there was no storage system for the paintings. They were just leaning up against the wall in the storage room. And I called Ross and I said, we've got to have a rack system. It was not part of the architectural program. It wasn't planned for in the budget. And in typical Ross Beach fashion, he said, well, Chuck, what does that cost? And I said, I've been told about $300,000. He said, take it out of the endowment, I'll make it up. And then we didn't have a collection management system. And so I called the only other money man that I knew personally, Tom Rawson. And he said, now what does that cost? And I said, well, they said it would be $25,000 to buy one off the shelf. And he came up with the money from his secret reserve. And then Tom may want to talk about one or two of the issues in building the museum. Why don't you, about we encountered issues as the museum was being built.
Well, you know, all projects have change orders. We have an ideal budget, and we have a bid, and away we go. Well, I talked a little bit about the underground river that flows under here. That's a change order, an expensive change order. So what's that mean? Maybe there are other things you can't do. Well, we sat down with EB and a bunch of folks and said, how in the world are we ever going to cut a bunch of money out of this project and have a completed project? And so we had some copper downspouts and gutters and all those types of things in there, and they were quite expensive. And so EB said, well, let's forget about all that copper out there. We can save a whole bunch of money. We can save some money, not a whole bunch. We can save some money. So Gary, were you the one that, yeah, you're the one that talked to Ross about that.
This is a good story.
I went out to talk to Ross because we had about $300,000 worth of cuts we needed to make in the building. And I was out at Beaches, and I told him what the problem was, the copper downspouts and some other things. And he says, well, Gary, he says, you need to be talking to somebody about paying for those. And I said, Ross, I am. And he looked at me, and if you know Ross, he was kind of a staunch Dutchman. He gave me that look, and he started grinning, and he says, go ahead and do it. And that was the way you really dealt with Ross. One of the other things I was going to talk about in fundraising, when EB's bid the building, we asked them to put a gift in kind, each contractor, of what they would basically write off of their bid. And EB's came in at $500,000, which was fairly close to what a lot of folks had done. And with all the change orders that Tom's talking about and everything else, EB's ended up somewhere between $1.5 million and $2 million when it was all said and done. And they graciously did that. So one of the other stories, and then I'll quit talking about on the EB thing, is if you go outside and notice the scalloped cement work on the second story, okay, Arthur Anderson decided it would be an architectural feat to pour that in place up on top of the wall, rather than take a 12-foot section, tip it upside down, and pour it as a standing monolith that you hoist up there. It's much easier, EB told me, because you have all these bubbles in cement and stuff that will migrate out with the vibrators, and you don't have this spalling or these little spots all over the cement. Arthur Anderson was having none of that. So we had a parking lot, Tom, filled with, we called them New Jersey Turnpike barriers, where they made these attempted pours to try to get this thing finally right. And they did. And if you look, those things are really smooth and really neat. But I suspect they spent a couple $100,000 trying to figure that thing out. And no, they did. And believe me, it's a gorgeous building, and I love the way they did it. But that's just one of the things we ran into, and the donors stepped forward and said, we'll deal with it. And if you go and say over here on the south side, halfway up, you'll see stonework, and then cement goes like this, and then the stone comes down again. That scalloped stonework was poured as part of the wall, and then the stone was set into it. It's much easier to pour a wall up, 20 feet high, pour these things on the ground, standing up, and then lift them up and set them there. But architecturally, it's not as challenging. And we had to have a challenge. So that's the New Jersey Turnpike barriers.
I want to tell one other story. I work for this guy that loves sod, and so we couldn't dedicate the building without having the lawn all sodded in. And so John said, I don't care where you get it, but get it down there and get it done before we dedicate the building. So we ordered some sod from somewhere out of Topeka or Kansas City or someplace, and it was the day of the dedication, the day of the grand opening, on a Friday afternoon, as I recall. We got a truckload in, and they started putting down the sod, and there's supposed to be another truckload in. Well, it didn't come, and it's getting closer to 6 o'clock at night, and all these people were going to come in their tuxes and all that stuff. So we got a call, and the truck that had the sod was overweight, and it was down at the weigh station west of Topeka, and they couldn't do anything without offloading part of the load. So we sent a truck down and put some of the sod on another truck. And I still think, Chuck, that at the time the first people were starting to arrive, they were still out putting sod in the yard, but enough for those stories. But it was kind of fun.
So this brings us to the opening of the museum, and all along we met with the construction company. They had a schedule, and the schedule progressively had to be extended. So we were to take possession of the museum in June 1st, and then have a gala opening in October. In fact, it was mid-August, and the staff, as Catherine can attest, had 1 month to move everything, all the artwork that Gary had provided a space for in the foundation building over here, hang it, get furniture, printers, copiers, computers all installed. They had 1 month to do it. Well, it was a real problem. I recall the meeting again at the foundation building. Our football team was finally doing pretty well in the mid-90s. And so we could only have a museum opening on a non-football weekend. But everybody wanted their meetings, you know. The fraternities and sororities wanted Mom's Weekend, and the Engineering Advisory Board and Agricultural Advisory Board. And we had half the hotels that we have now. So it was a real issue to block out rooms in a hotel and get caterers lined up and the rest of it. So we told them we have to know. Well, they guaranteed June 1st, so we picked the October non-football weekend as our date. And we couldn't change that. Invitations had gone out. And so kudos to the staff. They must have worked 12 or 15 just to get the museum ready for it. And then Tom told you about the President Weefald hates dirt. And there can be no museum opening unless the grass is in. And so that was his challenge right about that time. And then before that, we had the operations committee had a subcommittee called the sculpture committee or group. But we wanted, originally it was to find a nice piece of outdoor sculpture to set the building off, either in front where the chair is now, or over on the side where the prairie is. And so we went to Chicago to sculpture fairs, the Navy Fair, and we talked to Crosby Kemper. Actually, we had to his meeting room, and he says, well, what you need in that museum is a Chihuly. And we sat there kind of like country bumpkins, who? And so he gets this book out and puts it down on the table, and we saw some really nice glass work. Well, if you've been to the UMB Bank in Denver, the whole wall on the west side is covered with Chihuly glass. It's pretty terrific. And Crosby, as is typical, he says, and I'll pay a third of it. You get 2 other donors. We came back to Manhattan, and I called Jack Goldstein, and I said, would you be one of the 2 extra donors? He said, don't call anyone else. Crosby and I will do the whole thing. And they did. They paid for it. But it did present the building committee with the challenge, because the beam that held up the roof over that lantern was not designed to hold a 1,600-pound suspended sculpture. So they had to get a structural engineer to redesign that, then rebuild it so that it would hold that sculpture. And in case you wonder, it was all shipped here in boxes, and Del Chihuly and his crew had it all laid out down the hallway, all the pieces in some numbered order, and the scaffolding was built, and they hung those one piece at a time. Now, I don't know, remember how long, maybe Catherine, you can say how long it took, but.
Actually, it went really fast. It only took them 2 days.
Okay, but they had it well planned out.
They had 2 people from Chihuly Studio, Lindsay, and 2 graduate students. And, I mean, it was long days, but it only took them 2 days.
So that was one of the things that came up. And then I've already mentioned that we didn't have a storage system or a collection management system. And Tom's auditor, gently, in a 22-page report that had many pages of recommendations, said that nothing had been put on the inventory and that we had no financial accounting system either. And so that was done by Martha Scott's predecessor, Carol Dugan, who was here for only a few months before I needed a secretary in the president's office, and I took her up there, and we hired, 19 years ago, Martha. So those were some of the things that, it was exciting because these challenges pop up, and it was also, I can tell you, all 3 of us had jobs that had us cleaning up problems that we don't talk about. That was what my job was. And so it was a pleasure to work on something that was beautiful, uplifting, as building an art museum compared to the way I spent a lot of other time. And I'll just finish up my little piece of it by saying that the operations committee added people as we went along, like Gary Woodward, the head of the art department, Jack Goldstein, Mary Lee Graham, Don Rozak, who was a history professor but very involved in the arts, has been a major donor of artwork to the museum, a great supporter. Tom Shellhart, who was Tom Rawson's assistant, and Terry Van Meter, who was the director of the Cavalry Museum at Fort Riley. He had a tremendous background in museum management. And this morphed into what we then called the Museum Advisory Committee. And that's still in operation today, and they have several subcommittees, programming our exhibitions, acquisition, finance, and of course the people on the committee have changed, but that was the origin of it. And then we did a board of visitors, and the point of the board of visitors was to have people who had connections, would put it that way. They had money and they had connections. And so Ross Beach proposed at the first meeting of the Board of Visitors that each member would make a $2,500 a year contribution to the director's discretionary fund. And that could be in cash, or if they were able to either personally give art or get someone else to give art, we would credit them with that as well. And I think that's been pretty successful for one, it gives a steady income stream for the director, and secondly, it has connected us with a lot of people that have art that wanted to give it. And the collection went from, there were 1,600 pieces, I think, that Jessica Richmond found. That's my memory of 1,500 or 1,600. 1,500. And what do you have today? Almost 10,000. 10,000. Now, a lot of that has to do with people will not give you a painting that's valuable or valuable to them for maybe nostalgic reasons if it's going to hang in a dean's office. And God love the deans. But once you have a beautiful museum, it's going to be properly stored, properly exhibited in a curated program, then they're more likely to relinquish their art, to give their art, and they give it joyfully. So Do you want to say anything more, Gary, or?
Just add two things. One thing I didn't say about the foundation's role was the foundation was the owner of the building until it was completed, inspected, and then we gifted it to the university. That's why we were so involved in the construction of it too, and those sort of things. The other thing Chuck was talking about, gifts in kind. I have turned down gifts of a miniature bottle collection from airlines of liquor bottles, 6,000 of them that was wanted to give, a collection of Bavarian beer steins, you know, and yeah. It was one of those things where they'd make the gift, you know, that we asked, but you had to take this with you. And so we had to, you know, decline as nicely as we could. But I learned a lot about the art world, let me tell you.
So, I mean, we could go on with various stories, but I would rather now that we turn it into a conversation, and that we'd like to hear what's on your mind about these stories, this history of the origin of the Art Museum and its continuation today.
Thank you. And what I'd like to do is ask anybody who has a comment or a question to speak into the mic, which I will pass to you, because we are recording this as a history of the museum. So comments, questions? Yes.
My question is for the three panelists. Can you tell us kind of your most memorable story about fundraising for the museum?
Yeah, I can give you one. It's one of my favorite stories, and Chuck, I know, has heard this. I don't know if Tom has or not. The night we had the gala, the opening, and Tom and Chuck and I were all here till the last dog, and I was leaving, and out in that parking lot was Ross and Mariana in their Cadillac, and the door was open on the passenger side, and I walked out, and I wondered what the problem was, and Mariana used a pronoun, the word you, when she talked to me, and she meant it inclusively of all of us that had been involved, and she was weeping, and I asked what the problem was. She says, it's exactly what you said it was going to be. And to me, that's the best memory I have in fundraising. It really was.
So when Tom and I went to the archives a few weeks ago to see, fish through a box of various things, and there was a copy of this little speech that I gave at the opening gala. And if you remember that Ross put the name on the building as a 50th wedding anniversary present to his wife. And I said in there something like that, those of you who are approaching the 50th anniversary, you got a problem. Ross has set the bar up here, and don't think you can get away with a little diamond or some trip somewhere or even a new car. So then there was well, I was thinking of a story. Let me get the exact things in my mind, but we also needed more student help, and once again, Tom found the money for that. And you know, universities are always, like most people, strained for having the money for things they want to do. And I think that's when we got the budget from $20,000 to $40,000, and it's very similar to that even today for student help.
Can I just
Sure.
add a couple things here? I'm so grateful to both of you for referencing Mariana. The museum does bear her name, and there's a reason why it's named for her, because she did have such a passion for the arts and culture and education. And it was a really beautiful gift from her husband to her, but to honor that about her. So I think we sometimes talk about Ross and his making of the gift, but Mariana was really at the heart of that.
She always wrote the sweetest staff thanking us for this, that, or the other thing that you've heard about. I heard this from somebody, or, this was in the paper, she's always so aware of what we're doing.
And the effect in the community, she really followed it.
Yes, go ahead.
Well, everybody may know this story, but tell the story about where Ross and Mariana were engaged.
Oh, yeah, this is how the country song goes, partly fact and partly fiction. The dining hall was in Thompson Hall, which is now geology, which is right next door. And actually, part of the roof line was determined by having a roof line that was compatible with Thompson Hall's.
The architect told me that.
Yeah, roof line. And they lived in one of those small dorms that's just over by, just on the other side of Justin. Van Zyl and Putnam, one of those dorms. Somewhere between the dining hall, the student union at the time, and that dorm is where he proposed to her. Now, we don't know the exact spot on that walk from there to there, but I like to think that this was the spot.
And actually, Mariana says it's pretty darn close because I met a husband at the opening of the museum, and that always, for Mariana and I, that was our connection, is that I had met John, I had met my husband at that opening where the ribbon cutting. And so when I told Mariana that, she said, well, this is really where Ross and I got engaged. So I think it must have been really, really close to this spot. So, and we have seen many people kissing under the arch.
Well, I can tell another story that Lauren Render, previous director, and Gary and I went over to Lawrence. This is after the Beaches had moved from Hayes to Lawrence. And our idea is we were going to take them out to lunch and just, I don't think we had anything in mind. It was just a social visit. And what Ross wanted, he didn't want to go out to lunch. He wanted us to stop by the A&W and pick up a bag of hamburgers and some Cokes. And that's what we had lunch at their dining room table on A&W hamburgers. But that's just the way Ross was.
Any other comments, questions? This is your chance. These gentlemen were here. Excuse me.
Well, I have another question. So, when you were fundraising, what was kind of the strongest selling point that you had? What did you tell people that you felt had the most resonance, in getting them to commit to contributing to the building of the museum?
That's a good question. I didn't say anything. I didn't have to because I had Ruth Ann with me. And Ruth Ann was a phenomenal, sincere fundraiser. Unbelievable because it was from the heart. She never rehearsed or talked about anything she was going to talk to people about. She just went in and talked to them and asked. And I think the biggest thing was we don't have one. We're a major institution, major university. We don't have an art museum. We've got this wonderful display or a group of artwork on campus. It has to have a home. And then she talked about the students and the ability to interact with the museum and to do those kinds of things. So it was just her sheer enthusiasm and force of will on many times that really carried the day. It was phenomenal for me as a professional to watch her because, and the thing I guess that the highest compliment I can give her is that it was sincere. It really was. She just had a passion, and that's what it came across that way. So that's the answer.
Go ahead.
Chuck, did you have any trouble wrestling away the art that was stowed around the university and perhaps the greatest piece you got over here from someone's office?
Well, actually, that would be a question for Jessica Richmond because she did that. I think most people understood that the art was not being properly conserved, that the climate in some offices was too hot, the humidity was too high, too much sunlight on prints, and that the only way we could preserve and protect the university's collection was to take it somewhere else. And you know, the deans just had to go back to the way the professors did it. You had travel posters on one wall and family pictures on another. We didn't have artwork hanging in our offices. But I do want to tell a story about the expansion of the museum, because within 10 years, we were already talking about a museum expansion, and that's very quick in the history of museums. And so this would have been in 2001. We played Southern Cal, USC, in Los Angeles. Is that right? Is that when you got stuck out there?
It was 2 or 3 days before 9/11.
Right. It was the Saturday before 9/11. And so one of the things that Lauren had lined up for us, one was a cocktail with some potential donors, and the foundation had a list of Southern California donors there that we talked to. But we also spent a day at the Getty Museum. And so while we were there, Lauren and I hatched this plot that we would get a large poster of the Getty Museum. And at the Board of Visitors meeting, that was only a week or two later, that when we talked about an addition to the Beach Museum, we would show the picture of the Getty Museum and tell the Board of Visitors this is what we had in mind as the addition. So Arthur Anderson came up, and part of the program was that he had to figure out where we would have an addition, but that was dreaming back in '96. But the site had to have room for an addition, and the museum had to be built in such a way that you could add an addition that would be integral to the museum. And so Ross Beach asked Arthur, well, what does it cost these days per square foot for an addition? I think they wanted 15,000. Was that the square footage you wanted, 15,000? Okay.
15
So-
to 20?
So anyway, Arthur said, well, it's about 200, a little north of 200 a square foot. And so Ross and I both just went down and we started doing our numbers. Ross looks over at me and he said, what'd you get, Chuck? And I said, about 6 million. He said, yeah, that's what I got. Then he looks up without batting an eye, he says, all right, I'll put in the first million. So that was the start of the fundraising for the addition, which actually went pretty quickly because we already had the museum to show for it. I mean, people had already bought into the museum, and they wanted people who didn't get in on the first, like naming opportunities of rooms and so forth, now had a new opportunity to get in on the project.
That's wonderful.
Yeah, I was involved with that process, and it was very collaborative. It was great. And I think we got most of what we wanted out of it as staff. So I wanted to ask you about the mission. You talked about how you, before you hired Nelson Britt even maybe, you had a mission in mind for the museum. And I presume it was the collection and sort of preservation and celebration of regional art, right? But were there any discussions about that? How did that process go, the development of a mission?
Well, I mean, you have to build from your strength, and the collection that we already had, that 1,600 pieces that were already in our collection, were principally regional artists like Berger Sanzane, and we had some John Stewart Curry prints and drawings. And by the way, speaking of Ruth Ann, she went out and visited John Stewart Curry's widow in Connecticut, and a result of that visit is that we got 1,800 of his prints or drawings, a large number of them.
Something over 900.
900, okay. So
And
that
I just
came,
want to throw in that Don Lambert, an independent curator here in Kansas, played a big role in that, helping Ruth Ann get to know
Yeah.
Mrs. Curry.
He was the go-between
Yes.
that got Ruth Ann introduced there. And well, one other thing that surprised me, I mean, I was just an amateur admirer of art, no expertise in it. But we had an attorney come one day and he said, well, how would you like to buy some... Oh, well, is there a better place in this concrete?
Our security officer will show us.
All right.
You know, we need to go down near the art prep area named after Chuck.